Chapter 1. The world of Mala was a sheath of perpetual, late autumn gloom, and the Ironwood Keep, its ancient, skeletal heart. For 2 decades, the keep had housed only the rustle of dry, indifferent winds and the endless, aching guilt of its lone resident, Lord Valerius of the Ash Coven, the self-appointed king of the Sundered. He stood, an immutable statue of pale, carved marble, before a lancet window that saw nothing but the frosted mirror of its own reflection. His stillness was not peace, but the heavy inertia of regret, a condition shared by all those gifted with immortality, the curse of perfect memory. The memory that defined him most was not of any great battle or bloody covenant, but of a small, mud-spattered boy with eyes like chipped emeralds and a reckless, utterly human audacity. The boy, Kyle, had been dragged from a skirmish zone 20 years prior, a ragged, defiant thing, and had stared up at the king of vampires, not with fear, but with a gaze so fiercely proprietary it had momentarily pierced the king's centuries-old melancholia. "I'll be your king someday," the child had declared, his voice a reedy promise against the crackle of distant gunfire. Valerius, in a moment of detached, powerful mercy he had regretted every day since, had let the boy walk away, a deliberate fissure in the otherwise ruthless tapestry of his reign. Now, 2 decades had bled into the history books, and the fissure was a gaping, festering wound. Valerius's internal landscape was a chiaroscuro of exquisite suffering and ironclad discipline. His heart, a cold, calcified relic, pulsed with the rhythmic necessity of ancient power, yet yearned for an anchor, a simple, mortal tether to the world he was sworn to protect and to which he felt eternally estranged. He wore his crown of ancient, blackened silver less as a symbol of authority and more as a heavy, cold band of ceaseless duty. The air within the keep was thick with the scent of aged dust and the faint, coppery ghost of the blood he had sworn to refrain from spilling. Tonight, the silence of the keep was violently interrupted by the grating, high-pitched clang of the outer portcullis. It was a sound that tasted of intrusion, of danger, and above all, of the world he had tried to seal himself away from. A breathless, half-dead runner of the Ash Coven, his face a mask of terror and shame, was dragged by 2 loyal, stone-faced sanguinary guards into the great hall. The runner choked out a report that was both devastating and ironically perfect. The prophecy's key had been found, captured by the Order of the Silent Sun, and was being transported north. The transport had been intercepted on the bloody border of the Sundered lands. The prize? A single high-value captive, shackled and broken, but undeniably alive. The runner produced a small, leather-bound portrait, mud-stained and torn. Valerius took it. His fingers, long and inhumanly pale, almost crushed the cheap frame. The portrait was a charcoal sketch of a young man, a face etched with a familiar, reckless defiance, the eyes an unmistakable, defiant emerald. Kyle. The boy had returned, not as a king, but as a prisoner. The shock was a sharp, clean strike of ice against his immortal stillness, shattering the marble facade. The prophecy, long dismissed as a comforting fable for desperate humans, had spoken of a mortal anchor, a being capable of merging the ancient covenants and ending the eternal winter of the Sundered lands. Valerius had scoffed at it for centuries. Now, the potential anchor was the boy he had given a choice to, the boy who had promised to be his king. This was not a chance event. It was a cosmic joke delivered with brutal precision. His fierce, protective instinct, long dormant, flared up like a dying star's final, blinding light. The guilt that had been a silent companion now became a searing, driving force. He could not allow the fragile, audacious mortality he had preserved to be extinguished by the fanatical zealots of the sun. He would reclaim his mistake, his burden, his anchor. The air around him began to hum, the stone floor of the great hall vibrating with a power that tasted of thunder and millennia. Chapter 2. The journey from the keep was a blur of unnatural speed, a violence of motion that only a creature of Valerius's ancient lineage could sustain. The world outside the keep was a tapestry of grays and browns, skeletal branches of ironwood trees clawing at a heavy, bruised sky, the air stinging with the promise of snow that never quite fell. He rode not on a steed, but in a blur of liquid shadow, his cape, the color of dried blood and night, whipping around him like a vengeful storm. The sanguinary guards followed, spectral silhouettes against the gloom, sworn to silence and Valerius's iron will. His mind was a tempest of controlled, icy fury. The Order of the Silent Sun were zealots, fanatics who sought to purify the world through fire and the eradication of all things deemed unnatural. They saw the vampires as a blight, a cancer upon the mortal world, and the prophecy's key, Kyle, as merely a tool to be destroyed or weaponized against their ancient enemy. Valerius's internal monologue was one of brutal self-reproach and a burgeoning, fierce protectiveness. He hated himself for the vulnerability Kyle's reappearance had created, but he hated the world more for daring to touch what he had, in a moment of profound weakness, spared. The memory of his eyes, so impossibly green, was a physical ache. The interception point was a ruined, forgotten toll bridge over a black, sluggish river known to the locals as the Stygian Pass. When they arrived, the massacre was already complete. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, spent magic, and the metallic tang of fresh, mortal blood, not from the captive, but from the Order's own guards. The Silent Sun had not been silent enough. Another faction, one Valerius had not accounted for, had struck first. Scattered across the icy ground were the distinctive silver-enameled crests of the Blood Oath Syndicate, a powerful, ruthless collective of rogue vampires and dark mages who valued power and profit above all else. They were scavengers, drawn to the scent of high-value supernatural energy like carrion birds. The Syndicate's hand meant the stakes were now exponentially higher. Kyle was no longer merely a prisoner of the pious. He was a commodity of immense power, slated for sale to the highest, most dangerous bidder. Valerius moved through the wreckage with a terrible, silent grace. His eyes, usually a flat, cold gold, were now burning with a low, predatory fire. He found the Syndicate's trail quickly, a line of crushed, frozen moss leading southeast toward the ancient, neutral city of Viridia, a den of thieves and shadowy merchants. Before following, he stopped at the center of the bridge. Lying near a shattered black iron lamppost was a single silver shackle, discarded and broken, and a small, hastily tied strip of rough-spun cloth, smelling faintly of sweat and wood smoke. Kyle was wounded, but he had fought. The evidence only stoked Valerius's internal conflict, a profound respect for the boy's tenacious spirit coupled with a suffocating, almost possessive need to shelter him from the world's inevitable cruelty. He was a guardian, but a flawed one, defined by the blood he had taken centuries ago. "He will not be broken twice," Valerius vowed, the words a low, guttural promise that tasted of ash and power. The chase began anew, a relentless, desperate hunt, driven by the king's desperate need to fulfill an obligation he had unknowingly created 20 years ago. The sun was rising, a pale, anemic orb barely penetrating the heavy cloud cover, a constant reminder of the relentless march of time and the fragility of the human life he was pursuing. Chapter 3. Viridia was a cancerous bloom of ancient stone and desperation, a city where the light of the Silent Sun could not penetrate, and the iron rule of the Ash Coven held no sway. It was a haven for criminals, rogue mages, and the most avaricious members of the Blood Oath Syndicate. The market district was a maze of narrow, shadowed alleys, overflowing with stolen magical artifacts and the wretched remnants of human lives. Valerius entered the city cloaked, his inhuman features masked by a deep cowl, moving through the crowds with a terrifying liquid stillness that parted the mortals like water. The sensory overload of the city, the stench of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and the rich, terrifying scent of 1,000 different lifebloods was a physical assault, but his centuries of discipline held firm. He focused only on the trail, a unique magical signature, subtle but potent, that only a powerful seer could possess. He knew Chaol's specific power. The very thing that made him the prophecy's key was his ability to draw and anchor etheric resonance, terrifyingly volatile, raw magical energy. Valerius used his own ancient, refined senses to track the Syndicate's movements. They had taken Chaol to the Whispering Crypt, a section of the lower city reserved for the most sensitive and illicit transactions. This was the dark heart of Viridia, where even the Syndicate held its breath. When Valerius finally breached the crypt's outer defenses, shattering a complex runic barrier with a single contemptuous gesture of his hand, he found a horrifying tableau. Chaol was chained, not to the wall, but to a massive black iron altar at the center of the chamber, his body radiating a palpable aura of pain and suppressed power. 3 Syndicate members stood over him, a hulking brute, a sly rogue mage, and their leader, the formidable Lady Seraphina, a rogue vampire infamous for her cold ambition and mastery of dark covenants. Seraphina was beautiful in a sterile, frightening way, her eyes glittering with cold malice. Chaol's clothes were torn, and his pale skin was already bruised and bleeding, the result of their attempts to harvest his etheric resonance. But the true horror was the expression on Chaol's face. Not fear, but a searing, white-hot exhaustion and profound disappointment. He looked up, his green eyes meeting Valerius's, and for a long, agonizing moment, the air was utterly silent. The sheer weight of 2 decades, of a foolish promise and an impossible choice, hung suspended between them. Valerius's protective fury reached its zenith. Seraphina, his voice was a low, resonant note that seemed to shake the very foundations of the crypt. You trespass on what is mine. Seraphina smirked, a cruel, elegant curve of her lips. Valerius, the king of guilt, comes for his lost toy. This toy is worth 1,000 suns, your majesty. His blood is already singing with pure ether. We have begun the process of the etheric covenant. He will be ours, or he will be nothing. Chaol, through gritted teeth, finally spoke, the words a strained whisper, but laced with the old audacity. I told you I'd be a king. I didn't say whose. Valerius felt a strange, impossible spike of pride and agony. He cast off his cowl. The chamber was instantly bathed in the cold, oppressive shadow of his ancient power. The fight was quick, brutal, and a terrifying display of a king unbound. Valerius moved with a speed that defied physics, a whirlwind of ancient power and refined, predatory grace. The hulking brute was dispatched with a single, precise strike, his spine dissolving into ash. The rogue mage, a master of fire, was met with an icy wave of crimson thaumaturgy, Valerius's signature blood magic that froze the mage's fire in midair before tearing the man's life force from his body. Valerius advanced on Seraphina, his gold eyes burning. Yield or face the consequences of challenging the ash. Seraphina, recognizing the depth of his fury and the terrifying power it commanded, made a calculated, cynical choice. She vanished in a puff of acrid smoke, abandoning her prize. She knew better than to die over a mere transaction. Valerius ignored her escape. His focus was entirely on the boy, the anchor, the mistake he was desperate to correct. He moved to the altar, his heavy, protective hands reaching for the shackles. Chapter 4. Valerius worked with a controlled, surgical precision, the centuries of vampire discipline channeling his fierce emotion into delicate action. The chains holding Kyle were forged of obsidian iron, a metal specifically designed to suppress and siphon etheric resonance, the very energy that made Kyle the prophecy's key. The metal was burning Kyle's skin where it touched, the suppression causing his immense raw power to fight back, tearing at his physical form from the inside. This was what the Syndicate had meant by the etheric covenant: to break him, to turn him into a vessel of their power, or destroy him entirely. Valerius used a refined, almost invisible wave of his blood magic, an ancient art he rarely employed, to dissolve the suppressive runes etched into the metal. The chains fell away with a heavy, echoing clatter onto the stone floor. Kyle's body immediately slumped, his power briefly unchecked, and a wave of pure, raw, etheric resonance, a terrifying energy that smelled of raw creation and cosmic dust, roared through the chamber, making the stone walls vibrate before Valerius instantly sealed it, drawing the explosive power into himself, momentarily anchoring the volatile force within his own immortal core. Kyle lay against him, a weight of utterly human warmth and exhaustion against the vampire's cold marble. Valerius held him, his protective hands supporting the back of Kyle's neck and his spine. For a brief, terrifying moment, the king of the Sundered felt a profound, almost paralyzing vulnerability. He lifted the boy into his arms. Kyle was alarmingly light, a fragile construct of bone and conviction. As Valerius turned to leave, Kyle's emerald eyes fluttered open, his gaze locking with the vampire's gold. Kyle's voice was a rough, barely audible whisper, thick with pain and the faint residue of the etheric storm. The prophecy, they said I was meant to kill the King of Ash. Is that why you came? The question was a low, intimate dagger, striking at the very heart of Valerius's eternal dilemma. Was his mercy a betrayal of his people? Was his protection a means of self-preservation? Valerius paused, the answer a heavy, truthful weight in the oppressive silence. I came because I chose to, he stated, his voice low, formal, and utterly without inflection. 20 years ago, I gave a boy a choice, an impossibility in this world. The King of Ash does not permit others to clean up his mistakes. You are my burden, Kyle, and I am fiercely protective of what is mine. The declaration, though laced with the king's proprietary language, was a confession of commitment, a raw truth in the face of death and dark politics. Kyle simply closed his eyes, a flicker of something, relief, perhaps, or a deep, resigned trust, crossing his weary face. Take me home, then, Valerius, if you still have one. The word home struck Valerius with the force of a physical blow. The Ironwood Keep had never been a home. It was a mausoleum of guilt. But for Kyle, the boy who had defied the world, perhaps it could be. The journey back was a muted, heavy affair. The Sanguinari guards, seeing their king carry the small, broken human form so protectively, understood without a word the gravity of the shift in their world's axis. The prophecy had not been a myth after all. The anchor was found, and the king had claimed him. Chapter 5. Back within the ancient, cold embrace of the Ironwood Keep, Valerius personally oversaw Kyle's care, an intimacy of action that shocked the loyal, distant Sanguinari. Kyle was settled in Valerius's private wing, a massive, quiet chamber lined with forgotten, dust-shrouded texts and ancient relics. The king stripped away the remaining traces of obsidian iron poison from Kyle's wounds with a fine silver needle and a meticulous application of his own rarefied medicinal blood magic, a soothing, cool energy that tasted of crushed iron and starlight. The healing was slow, not because of the physical wounds, but because of the deep, volatile exhaustion of Kael's immense, repressed power. Kael drifted in and out of consciousness, his delirious murmurs often revolving around fragments of the prophecy, the harsh treatment of the silent sun, and the terrifying cold beauty of the etheric resonance, the power that both sustained and threatened to consume him. In his moments of lucidity, the philosophical dialogue, so characteristic of Valerius's existence, began. "I saw what you did, Valerius," Kael whispered one evening, his voice weak but his eyes intensely lucid, focused on the vampire king standing in the Gothic archway, watching the perpetual gloom outside. "The strength, the cruelty you used to protect. You killed them without hesitation. Is that the price of immortality, to lose mercy entirely?" Valerius turned, his gaze heavy and melancholic. "Mercy is a luxury afforded only to the dead, Kael, and to the young. My kind deals in necessity. My choice 20 years ago to spare you was a monumental act of mercy. It brought me 2 decades of guilt, and it has now brought you to this state. The Order and the Syndicate deal in absolutes. I deal in protection, and protection requires a ruthlessness you cannot yet comprehend. I have the power to stop the endless night, Kael, but it requires me to be the endless night." He approached the bed, his presence filling the room with a cold, almost oppressive stillness. The etheric resonance is a terrible power. It will not be anchored by a human heart full of doubt. It demands conviction. It demands a king. Kael stared up at him, the tension in the room thick with unspoken questions. "Why me? Why the boy who was meant to kill you? There are others." "You declared your intent, Kael," Valerius said, his voice dropping to an intimate, low resonance. "That audacity, that conviction, is the key. You looked at a creature of eternal night and spoke of a sunrise. You spoke of choice in a world of predestination. You, boy, are the etheric anomaly, and now you are bound, by fate and by my own foolish protective mistake, to the Ash Coven. You are my anchor, and I am your guardian." He placed a hand, cold, heavy, and reassuring, on Kael's forehead. "Sleep. Gather your strength. The covenants of the sundered lands will not wait for a wounded king to recover his balance." The profound, high-stakes vulnerability of their exchange hung in the silence. They were 2 forces, a creature of eternal night and a vessel of raw creation, tied together by a single, audacious promise made in the mud 20 years before. Chapter 6. Days bled into a measured, somber rhythm of recovery and instruction within the Ironwood Keep. Kael's physical body slowly mended, but the true battle was one of mind and spirit. Valerius, the ancient king, became a patient, intensely demanding tutor. He did not teach Kael to fight, but to understand the terrifying power that flowed through him. He taught him the difference between simple magic and etheric resonance, the raw, unshaped force of creation that made him the prophecy's key. "You do not wield the ether, Kael," Valerius explained one evening, standing before a towering obsidian hearth, the glow of the controlled fire casting stark shadows across his inhuman features. "You are merely its lens, its anchor. The moment you doubt your conviction, the power will consume you. It is a force of terrible beauty, and it requires a king with an unwavering will to guide it." Kael, now stronger, sat in a velvet-draped armchair, absorbing the formal, poetic instructions with a mixture of terror and fierce concentration. "And what if my conviction is to tear your world down, Valerius? The prophecy—" "Is a guide, not a chain," Valerius interrupted, his voice sharp and final. "I do not fear death, Kael. I fear the chaos that will follow. Your power is the only thing that can bind the rogue covenants and prevent the final, eternal sundering of the lands. If your choice is to destroy me, then destroy me after you have saved my people. Until then, you will obey my instruction." Their relationship settled into a tense, intimate alliance, the fiercely protective guardian, driven by guilt and ancient duty, and the vulnerable, powerful human, driven by a deep, unwavering conviction he had yet to fully grasp. The political tremors of Chaol's reappearance were beginning to shake the very foundations of the sundered lands. Messengers from the Ash Coven's wary allies, the Stone and Ice Covens, arrived demanding audience, seeking assurance, and sniffing for weakness. Valerius met them with an icy, imperial dismissiveness, his protective stance towards Chaol non-negotiable. He knew that the Blood Oath Syndicate and the Silent Sun would not concede their prize. The siege was coming. One late evening, as a freezing mist curled around the keep, Chaol approached Valerius in the library, a vast, cold expanse of forgotten knowledge. Chaol held a thin, worn volume, an ancient text describing the final covenant of the prophecy. He looked up at Valerius, his emerald eyes intensely focused, no longer solely on the king, but on the man beneath the mantle. The book says the anchor must choose, to merge the ash and the mortal, or to destroy one entirely. Valerius, when I am ready, when I finally grasp this power, what will you choose? The vulnerability in the question was profound, a raw plea for honesty. Valerius turned from the ancient window, his posture losing a degree of its unnatural stiffness. He saw not a strategic asset or a threat, but the fragile, audacious boys who had dared to speak of kingship. My choice was made 20 years ago, Chaol, Valerius said, his voice low, intimate, and stripped of the usual formality. I chose you. I chose the possibility of the future over the comfort of the eternal past. Whatever your final choice may be, know this. I am your anchor now. I will ensure you have the strength to make it. And if your choice is to destroy me, I will meet it, knowing I finally paid the debt of my endless, self-hating life. The moment was heavy with the weight of prophecy and a fierce, terrifying affection. As Valerius stepped closer, his gold eyes meeting Chaol's emerald, the king's face was a mask of cold resolve and quiet hope. They had anchored each other, not in power, but in a shared, impossible burden. The distant, ominous sound of 1,000 horns, the clarions of the silent sun, signaling the imminent siege, echoed through the Ironwood keep. The final conflict had begun.